This is David Wiggins. I'm a professor and director of the School of Recreation, Health, and Tourism at George Mason University. I was selected or elected into the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education in the year 2007 with a number of 483. With me this afternoon is Dr. Rainer Martens. Rainer is the president and founder of Human Kinetics Publishers, which is the world's largest publisher of books, journals, videos, and software in the sports and fitness fields. Rainer is also well known for creating the American Sport Education Program, the largest coaching education program in the United States, with over 1 million coaches completing ASEP courses. He has also written more than 100 scholarly articles dealing primarily with sports psychology, has made more than 300 professional presentations, and has written 16 books. Among those 16 books are such well-known pieces as The Joy and Sadness in Children's Sports, Successful Coaching, Coach's Guide to Sports Psychology, Guidelines for Children's Sports, Competitive Anxiety in Sport, and Directing Youth Sport Programs. In 1980, Rainer was elected to the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education, along with 12 other individuals, and his number is 272. Rainer, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Why don't we begin, if you would, by just talking very briefly about your various highlights of both your educational as well as professional career.
Well, my education at the collegiate level started at what was then Kansas State Teachers College, which is now Emporia State University, where I got my bachelor's. And then I went to the University of Montana with a graduate assistantship and was the wrestling coach and did my master's degree there, and taught a year in Missoula, Montana, at a high school called Hellgate High School, and then decided I would like to go back for my doctorate, and was accepted into the program at the University of Illinois, and that's where I completed my PhD degree in 1968.
Okay.
And was very fortunate to be offered what at that time was a very unusual position. Mike Ellis, who's also a member of the Academy, was the director of the Motor Performance and Play Research Lab at the Children's Research Center at the University of Illinois. And that center had received a lot of research funds. And so I was hired as a full-time researcher, and I don't think anyone at any university in physical education had ever been employed as a full-time researcher. So it was a very unique position.
Right. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I spent then 16 years as a professor at the University of Illinois, and had fantastic graduate students and wonderful support from the university, and imagined that my life would be as a professor until I retired. And in 1973, we hosted a sports psychology conference at the University of Illinois. It was the North American Society for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity, and it was the first time that group met separate. It used to always meet one day in front of the AFERD conference. And it was a good conference, and some excellent papers were presented, and I was encouraged to team up with Mike Wade and publish the proceedings of that. We couldn't find any publisher that would accept it, and so my late wife, Marilyn, and I did it on our own, not knowing a thing about what we were doing. But that was the start of Human Kinetics. And so we officially have the date of Human Kinetics start as 1974, when that book was released. And that started a company that eventually in 1984, I decided that I should leave the university and pursue publishing full time.
Okay. Is it true? I've often heard the story that you and Marilyn actually the basement of your house on top of your ping pong table.
You heard accurately. Yes, the business was for 3 or 4 years when it was just starting up on the ping pong table, and we had 3 vegetable bins, and one was for cash orders, one was for credit orders, and one was for receipts. And that's how we began.
Well, I would expect, being an academic myself, I would expect that there was a bit of a steep learning curve for you. I mean, to go from a professor of psychology and becoming a businessman, if you will. Is that true?
That's true. It was a learning process along the way, but I think you can appreciate this, that once you've learned science and and the methodology of doing research, that's just a problem-solving skill.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things that really served me well was applying that problem-solving skill to the problems that I encountered in publishing, and I encountered a number of them because I had no background in it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We may get back to human kinetics in a few minutes, but Reiner, when I was looking at the inductees for 1980, sportscasters often like to talk about the year of the quarterback. It just seems to me when I look through this list of the inductees for the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education for 1980, my gosh, what an impressive group. In addition to yourself, there was Ted Baumgartner, Chuck Corbin, Barbara Drinkwater, Mike Ellis, Antoinette Gentile, Marilyn Henson, Michael Pollack, James Skinner, Peter Arnold, Bob Morford, Lawrence Green, Paul Torrance, in addition to yourself. Any particular stories, any particular memories about your fellow inductees from 1980?
Well, I really didn't remember who they all were, but that is a really impressive group. I feel pretty fortunate to be included with that group. A number of those individuals became friends or were friends at the time of the induction, and many of them have become authors for human kinetics over the years. And now many of them are retired and have established themselves as really having distinguished careers. So,
right.
Great memories of those folks.
Have you? I'm curious. Have you maintained contact with any of those individuals?
Actually, not in the last 4 or 5 years. I used to maintain good contact with Mike Ellis.
Yes.
I haven't recently since he's retired.
Okay. Another question for you is about any of the early leaders in physical education and kinesiology that most affected you in your career. And do you have any particular stories or anecdotes about those individuals?
Well, I think the individual that opened the door for me, that had that significant influence, was Earl Ziegler. And Earl is, as you know, well known and distinguished in our field. He was the head of the Department of Physical Education at the University of Illinois, and he selected me to enter the doctoral program there. And that year we had Glenn Roberts come to study, Dan Landers, Mike Wade, Dick Schmidt was there from the previous year. Mike Ellis had started the previous year. We really had an outstanding group of doctoral students. And that was a time when physical education was under attack in higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a movement within the major universities, and certainly the University of Illinois was one of them, to begin to really dig into the science of human movement. And a small group of us were very interested in sports psychology. And while Earl Ziegler was not a sports psychologist, his interest was in history and philosophy and sport management, he was very receptive to the students pursuing the lines of study that they wanted to pursue. So he encouraged us. He provided a very stimulating environment. And he was someone that I have remained in contact with. In fact, in August, he just celebrated his 90th birthday and is still writing and is still advocating for the profession.
Fantastic. When you said that under attack, you're referring to people like James B. Conant from Harvard, who I know had launched some serious complaints and criticisms towards physical education, and then responding to his attacks were people like Franklin Henry, who were talking about the academic discipline of physical education.
Absolutely, that's exactly correct. It was Conant who really suggested that physical education had no place in, particularly in graduate education,
mm-hmm.
in higher education, and he just couldn't see it as a discipline. And Franklin Henry responded back to that. There are a lot of great stories about Franklin Henry, as you know. I remember visiting his office at the University of California, Berkeley, and this man had the highest piles of paper that I've ever seen on a desk. And he was late in his career at that point, was an amazing man who had unique insight into our field. And I've always treasured the opportunity to speak with those individuals in our field that were pioneers and could offer the perspective of 30, 40, 50 years of
mm-hmm.
being in our profession. And
yeah.
Franklin was one of those.
Yes. I'm also curious, Reiner, about can you talk a little bit more about Earl? I mean, was he an outstanding teacher, just somebody that was inspirational? I guess in addition to that question, was there something else about the University of Illinois that might have attracted you and Michael Ellis and Wade and the rest?
Well, I'll answer the latter part first.
Okay.
The University of Illinois advertised that it had a leading sports psychology program, and that Coleman Griffith, who was the founder, kind of considered the father of American sports psychology,
mm-hmm.
Was at the University of Illinois and did pioneering research back in the 1920s and used to throw batting practice for the Chicago Cubs and would administer personality tests in the 1930s. So, and the university in their promotional material said it had this excellent sports psychology laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember traveling to Champaign and pulling a U-Haul truck behind my Mustang, and as I arrived, the first thing I did, I didn't look for housing or anything else. I pulled up to Huff Gym, and I raced up these 4 flights of stairs to the 4th floor because I wanted to see this unique laboratory. Well, it was a big disappointment. It was nothing but a bunch of old equipment piled up in a corner and a lot of dust gathered on it. And as it would be, the University of Illinois really did not have anyone on the faculty that was teaching sports psychology or doing research in it. And that was a big disappointment. And after the first semester, I thought of leaving the University of Illinois.
Hmm.
But I remember a group of us doctoral students going to the AFERD National Convention in 1966, which was held at Las Vegas. We drove all the way out there and started talking with other people. And through the talking with fellow doctoral students, not only from the University of Illinois, but other places, I really realized that doctoral education is about going out and getting it yourself with the help of faculty and with the help of fellow doctoral students. And I came back to the university really rejuvenated by that. And Dan Landers and I, and Glenn Roberts, the three of us particularly, started investigating who could help us over in the psychology department. And at that time, the University of Illinois psychology department was rated in the top 5.
Yes.
And we found a fellow named James Davis who was a social psychologist, and we really cornered him, and he ended up helping us a great deal. And because his interest was social psychology, if you look at the early work that Dan Landers and Glenn and I did,
yes.
It was around the issues of the day in social psychology applied to the physical activity domain.
Yes.
So we were studying social facilitation, modeling effects, coaction effects, those kinds of things.
It's interesting to me as well. Now Coleman Griffith was he not in the education department or the psychology department?
Educational psychology
That's
was
right,
his
yes.
department, and you may know, since you're a well-known historian, that Coleman Griffith later became the provost of the university.
Yes, yes.
And I've always kind of admired him and have a couple of his original books that he wrote back in the 1920s on the psychology of athletics. But I had a neighbor where we lived in Champaign who had actually worked with Griffith back in the 1940s and gave me some personal insight about this man. And I guess as a provost, he was an absolute tyrant. And they ended up throwing him out of that position. But he certainly helped start sports psychology way back in the 20s.
Well, he utilized, if I'm correct, he is somebody that was fascinated by Red Grange and did some work with Red Grange at the University of Illinois, and
I believe that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And with the Chicago Cubs record, I'm not so sure how good a job he did.
Well, they were better then.
And I asked you the question, Reiner, about Earl in terms of anything else that you'd like to say about Earl and his influence on you.
I would describe Earl as a broad thinker, and who I think his best contribution was creating an academic environment that was open to alternative viewpoints. I really admired him for that, and he used to have great debates with other faculty members. He would take pretty strong opinions about certain things, and that led for a good deal of stimulation for the graduate students. So I think he just created a fantastic environment for students that were there at the time who've gone on to prove themselves as outstanding leaders.
Fantastic. Reiner, major turning points in the field. What do you consider the major turning points in the kinesiology and physical education profession during your career? And turning points that have been good, bad, maybe a combination of the two. Can you point to anything?
Well, I think we've already talked about one, and that was the James Conant criticism and the response of the field. And besides Franklin Henry making a case for our field, the field responded by graduate students like those of us at the University of Illinois and other institutions around the country, really beginning to dig into the subdisciplines that emerged from that, the fields of exercise physiology, biomechanics of sport, motor learning and behavior, sports psychology, sociology of sport, history of sport, philosophy of sport. All of these subdisciplines, I think, began to really define themselves during the late 60s and early 70s. And if you look at the history of these subdisciplines, that's when you see the pioneers emerging in the field and associations beginning, and then journals being launched, and later followed by reference books and then eventually textbooks. So that was a movement that was, I think, outstanding. Some things that were also happening as the field took on this science interest, it almost ousted physical education.
Yes.
And physical education and the preparation of physical education teachers in many curriculums got lost. And at the same time, one of the problems in higher education was that university coaches were given employment within physical education curriculums and often were cited for very poor teaching. And so universities, to strengthen their physical education programs, moved those coaches out of their departments by and large.
Yes.
And so coaching education also at that time was abandoned. And then we went through a period of, well, who are we? We wanted to try to define ourselves. And I remember Jack Razor doing a study to come up with all the different names that our field was using. And I remember it was like 100 and some different names from different sports science and physical education combinations and so on. So we really struggled with that. The outcome of that, I think, was actually healthy, although the process was painful and maybe unnecessarily long. But today, I think we have better definition that there is the discipline of kinesiology, which is the name I like to use for it. Some other names are still used, but and then there are professions that utilize kinesiology as its knowledge base, along with some other disciplines, for a variety of professions, physical education being only one, but still a significant one. And coaching education is gradually coming back into some institutions, and that's been an area that I've had a long-standing interest in, as you mentioned, with the American Sport Education Program. And so we've been doing coaching education outside of the university. I'm a strong advocate for coaching education being done within the university, and would like to see more and more curriculums that would prepare coaches both with an undergraduate preparation and graduate preparation. So those were some of the things that I saw happen from the late 60s into the 90s. Perhaps one of the negative things is not only did we see coaches occupying positions in physical education programs in higher education, we saw coaches occupying physical education positions, both in elementary and especially at the secondary level.
Right.
And many of those individuals were not committed to physical education, but their interest was in coaching. And so physical education was often taught very poorly.
Yes.
And we earned a rather poor reputation. And so when budget cuts were necessary, physical education was often cut from programs. And so I think we brought a lot of that on ourselves. And I think that was a real negative. Another negative that still exists is if you look at the population of physical education teachers at the elementary and secondary school level, the estimates are somewhere between 150 and 200,000 people. The membership in the National Association of Sport and Physical Education is about 15,000. So about 10%
yes.
of physical educators belong to a professional society. Probably a somewhat greater number also belong to perhaps their state association. But I'm concerned that we still have a profession of physical education where a small minority are really committed to professional behavior, and that we need to figure out how to improve the professionalism of physical educators in this country. And I see some really substantial improvement on the part of the National Association of Sport and Physical Education and academic institutions to try to prepare better physical education teachers. And we are now at that stage where many of those less than professional people that have been filling those positions are now retiring. And so we have an opportunity to really move ahead.
Right.
Finally, maybe a last point here is that particularly in the last 10 years, the combination of the scientific work that our field has been doing, the research in exercise physiology, and really all of the research has established kinesiology as an important discipline, and the recognition in our society of the importance of movement, first and foremost now for health reasons, and that we have friends in high places and friends in well-established professions such as the medical field that are advocating for physical activity. And so from a period of time in the 70s and 80s when being in physical education was a low profession, today being a physical educator, working in the physical activity field, trying to improve the health and fitness of individuals is recognized as a very significant activity to do, and that is absolutely inspiring to me.
Yes. Rainer, you mentioned coaching education programs, and while it's certainly not my expertise, my sense is that coaching education programs have, let me say it this way, coaching education programs in certain places in Europe, coaching education programs in Canada certainly, seem to be much more acceptable within educational institutions than in the United States. Would you agree with that? And if you do, why do you think that's the case?
I'm not sure I know the answer. I'm not sure that the assumption that you made is correct.
Okay.
I would state it this way. I think coaching education is much more accepted in most major sporting nations than it is in the United States. That
Okay.
I would agree with. Whether it's in academic institutions or not, my hunch is that it's not.
All right.
I think what's happened in Canada, in Germany, England, Australia, Japan, they all have national coaching education requirements that come through their national sports organizations. Often they're National Olympic Organization. That's where the education is coming from. The United States has it's been a huge challenge. I probably one of my biggest disappointments in my career in the field has been the failure to really see significant growth in coaching education. I've been working at it since the mid-1970s. And I have made many trips to the U.S. Olympic headquarters in Colorado Springs. I've frequently met with the executive directors of that organization to try to establish national coaching education programs. We've had a lot of false starts that ended up not going anywhere. We have tried to work with many national organizations, and we have made some progress, but it has not been primarily through academia. One of the challenges in the United States is that we do not have a national structure that organizes all of sport as they do in other countries. So we have sport organized at so many different levels. People from other countries find it hard to understand. We have Little League Baseball that's got 4 million kids in it.
Right.
We have high school sports organized at the educational level. We have college sports, professional sports. We have club sports that people know little about. I participate in slow pitch softball, and it's estimated that there are 20 million people playing slow pitch softball through recreational programs and other national organizations that are not affiliated with any governmental structures. So sport is organized in very many different ways, and what happens is each of those organizations is competing for players and for coaches, and so they're very protective of their membership. And at the youth level, where I think coaching education is so urgently needed, these organizations are often afraid to impose any educational standards on coaches because the coaches are volunteering. And
Yes.
so that has made it very difficult. But progress is being made. It's just been painfully slow over many years.
You know, Ryder, maybe in a number of ways you've already answered the question I'm about ready to pose, but I will ask it anyway. Why did you choose to teach and to do research in sports psychology? Was there something about your athletic background, particular interest in sport? Is there anything that you can point to that kind of drew you to sports psychology?
Well, in my undergraduate days, I mean, I always played sport. I grew up playing sport, at all different kinds of sport. But in my undergraduate days, I didn't have very good guidance in high school in terms of what to major in, and I switched majors about every semester. And I was trying to find something that really interested me. And for a while, I didn't want to go into physical education because that didn't have the kind of prestige.
Right.
So I avoided physical education for a while. I started taking a lot of psychology courses, and I found that very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of my first semester, my junior year, I just knew that physical education and coaching and sport was where my real love was. And so I became a physical education major late, took a couple summers of extra classes to complete my degree in 4 years. And so I had all this psychology and I had this interest in sport and physical education. So that kind of came together. And quite frankly, in my early days of participation, anxiety was a significant problem for me. So, you study what you hope maybe you can fix about yourself. So I think that's how it came about.
Okay. Again, maybe you've already answered it to some extent, but you're optimistic about kinesiology. You think we're making progress, albeit in a very slow and, as you say, sometimes painfully slow way. But are you hopeful?
Well, with regard to kinesiology, some of the comments I had made previously was really talking about professions, physical education as the profession and coaching as a profession. And particularly coaching education has been terribly slow because that's been something I've wanted to try to accomplish and haven't done very well. The field of kinesiology, I think, is coming together. We used to hear a lot of discussion about the fragmentation of the subdisciplines, and one of the problems that occurred and is still occurring is that departments, as they would specialize in a subdiscipline related to kinesiology, would sometimes then, when universities wanted to do consolidation and save money, would incorporate that subdiscipline into, let's call it, the mother discipline.
Yes.
So we saw that at UCLA early. We see that problem on the West Coast today.
Yes. Yeah.
And I, at several of the academy meetings, I had conversations with colleagues, and particularly Roberta Rickley had been sharing this problem and presented a paper at I'm forgetting the organization.
Was it in Quest?
Yes, she presented the paper in Quest, and she printed the paper there, and it was at
was it the NAPCAHEE?
Yeah, NAPCAHEE.
Okay.
That she made the presentation. I happened to be at that meeting, and it really struck me as our field has all these subdisciplines, but there is no voice for all of kinesiology. And, so the foundation that Julie and I started, the Human Kinetics Foundation, we brought together a group of the leaders of these different subdisciplines, and over the last 3 years we've helped to sponsor the startup of the American Kinesiology Association to try to address that. And I'm very optimistic about kinesiology. You look at programs around the country, and you see huge enrollments.
Yes.
And you see good students, and they're using kinesiology's knowledge base to prepare for entry into other graduate programs. They're using it for preparation to go into physical therapy, pre-med, a number of different fields. And I think that's really exciting.
Yes, yes. Reiner, one last question from me. I'm curious as to how you're spending your time. I assume you're playing a lot of softball. I assume that you and Julie are doing a little traveling. How has the transition been from, being, I don't know exactly how to say this, the full-time person at Human Kinetics, and
right.
how?
I was just giving a presentation yesterday, and I told someone that Julie and I are recovering workaholics, and we used to work. It was not unusual to work 70, 80-hour work weeks
right.
With Human Kinetics, and we loved it. But we moved to Florida full time 6 years ago, and I had played softball up until my late wife Marilyn was quite ill, and I quit when I was about 45, I think. And when I turned 55, they had a senior softball league in Champaign-Urbana, and someone called me and asked me to play, and I said, no, I'm too busy. I can't play, and I'm always traveling. I wouldn't be a good team player. Well, they called me up a month later, and they said, look, we're short. We just need a player tonight. Can you come out and help us? I said, okay. Well, I went out, and, it was like an alcoholic taking that drink. And my gosh, I realized how much I missed it, and I started playing senior softball from there. And we'd come down to Florida for short visits, I discovered, wow, they really play senior softball down here. I wasn't sure I could play at that level, but I started playing, and one good thing after another has happened, and I play with the most fantastic team in the country. Currently, we're in the 65 and over age category. We've played in 6 national tournaments this year. We've won all 6 of them. And we won the most significant one just this last weekend. And I really had an honor of a lifetime. I was inducted into the Senior Softball Hall of Fame this last week.
Oh, fantastic. So,
yeah, it's just that Julie and I have both been involved in it extensively, and we've really found it a fun experience in our lives, and it connects to so many of the things that I've done in the past.
Sure.
I finally got over that anxiety problem, and I try to be cautious in using any sports psychology on the field, but the other thing that you're correct about is that we have been fortunate to do a great deal of traveling. We just came back from a wonderful trip to the Arctic. We were watching polar bears way up above the Arctic Circle.
Very nice.
Last February, we were in the Galapagos Islands, Argentina. We went to Antarctica the year before. So many wonderful things. So Julie's fully retired, and I just say I'm semi-retired, and I still try to consult with Human Kinetics on a regular basis.
Right. It just occurred to me, too, Reiner, that while you were a faculty member at Illinois for a relatively short time, did you say 16 years?
Right.
I'm struck by the number of quality graduate students that you have.
I had some terrific students, yes.
And you must be awfully proud of Tara Scanlon, people like Tara and Dan Gould and people like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've gone on to distinguish themselves in the profession, and you're always proud and pleased to see them do well. So yeah,
yes.
That's been great. Yeah, if I might just throw something in here.
Sure.
when human kinetics was first starting and I was still on the faculty, people kind of looked at me like I was crazy. Why are you, doing this? Trying to be in business? And it took quite a few years, but as human kinetics then started really gaining some stature, we released a number of journals.
Yes.
That very much turned around, and so I think while I thoroughly enjoyed my academic career, I just couldn't have asked for better support, outstanding graduate students. It was clear to me that I could have a greater impact on our field through the publishing program.
Yes.
And so it wasn't a very hard decision because I kind of gradually phased out of the university and then went full time, as I said, in 1984 to the publishing program. And so that was a pretty easy direction for me.
Well, those of us who publish and make efforts to disseminate information are very thankful you made that move.
Well, thank you. And our field absolutely needed it. The publishers were leaving our field when they saw physical education in the decline, and there just were so few publishing opportunities. And it's great to see. I think we publish 24 journals now in our field.
Yes.
Each year we're coming out with about 150 new books.
Yes.
And we've not only published for the profession and textbooks, but we try to take what I describe as the real experts, people from our field, and bring them to the public through our publishing of what are called trade books, the kind of books that you purchase at Barnes & Noble or Borders and so on. So, yeah, we're really pleased about that.
Well, it also seems to me, I'm just coming out with the second volume of my Sport in America.
Yeah.
And a hardback edition as well as an e-book. And it's always struck me that human kinetics seemed, on the cutting edge, doing different things. And, I applaud the organization for the company for doing that.
Well, sometimes it was the bleeding edge. We got a little ahead of ourselves. I actually, about 1996, thought that I could see this electronic revolution coming.
Right.
And we jumped into it, and it was a little ahead of the marketplace. And so there were some painful years with that, but our industry is in the midst of one of the greatest revolutions ever. Historians will look back at this 100 years from now and just talk about this transformation, the way we distribute information. And I think that's exactly as with your book. It's going to come out in print. It's going to come out in electronic form.
Right.
It's going to be delivered electronically in many different ways. And today, one of the things that you'll hear in the hallways of human kinetics is how are we going to repurpose this content that we've got? Because there may be a fantastic chapter in your book and a fantastic chapter in several other authors' books, and a professor wants to put a course together and pull those chapters together, and we can deliver that electronically very efficiently.
Yes. Reiner, anything else that you'd like to mention at all before we finish?
Well, I've had a fantastic career, and the profession has been so good to me and to Julie and to human kinetics, and I just couldn't be more pleased with what has happened, and we look forward to because of the good luck that we've had with human kinetics to continuing to try to support and develop programs for the kinesiology and physical education fields.
Terrific, Reiner. Listen, thanks so much.
My pleasure. This was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. I could I could do it for a little while longer, that's for sure. Brendan, I very much look forward to seeing you and Julie in San Diego.
Oh, great. Yeah, we're looking forward to coming.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk some more and continue our discussion. And much appreciated, Reiner, and thank you.
Well, David, thank you for doing the interview.
Oh, my pleasure, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
All right.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.